The purpose of punishment, a Dvar Torah for Parashat Ekev. Earlier this week, my mother-in-law shared with us a confession made by her older sister. When she was in the 6th grade, she was sent as punishment to the 5th grade for a lesson. This horrifying tale raised the question of whether or not this would still be an acceptable form of punishment today, or was this too much of an embarrassment for the tender-hearted student to handle? To which I replied that I never found those punishments humiliating, but rather looked at them as an opportunity for mayhem on a greater scale. But that's a discussion for a different time. What I do think that this story has to do with this week's Parsha is trying to get some perspective on harsh measures carried out towards those in one's care, and I'd like to open with a question. Why did the Israeli people roam the desert for 40 years? The question seems ridiculous since every child knows that this was God's way of punishing them for the sin of the spies, but what was it trying to achieve? Well, during Moshe's speech this week, while commanding us to keep Hashem's rules, Moshe tells Bnei Israel to make sure they remember all the way which Hashem your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. And here's where things get a little bit complicated. The reason given is למען ענותך לנסותך לדעת את אשר בלבבך התשמור מצוותיו אם לא. Which, according to the English translation I found in the Torah, means that he might humble you, to prove you, to know what is in your heart, whether you will keep his commandments or not. Which is interesting, since this doesn't seem to be the reason given by Midbar or in Dvarim Bet, but setting that aside, there seem to be a number of purposes for which Moshe thinks keeping Bnei Israel out of the Promised Land is acceptable. The first revolves around the word anotcha, which we explained as humble you, derived from the words ani, or anava, but can also mean le'anot. And since I don't want to use the word torture, let's just say it means cause discomfort, like translated by Targum Yerushalmi, Rashbam, and others, which I guess is also a way to humiliate someone. And there might be a number of ways that staying in the wilderness achieved this goal. 1, there were no food storages, thus their dependence on Hashem for food was blatantly apparent, this Rashbam says. And 2, not having a home to call your own is an extremely humiliating experience. Just ask Ibn Ezra. But was learning humility the real reason why we were kept in the desert? Well, the next word adds another dimension. The purpose of anotcha is to lenasotcha, which we translated as to prove you, due to various theological issues discussed at length by the commentators around the story of the Akedah. But there are those who claim, among others, that this was a test, chizkuni, or proof to others, sforno, that although Bnei Israel have sinned, they have paid for it and are now ready to get on with their lives. So here you have it. We've derived the purpose of punishment for the sin of the spies, and all's well that ends well, except for the minor fact that a new question arises when we notice that the same word, vaya'ancha, is used to describe the hardship Bnei Israel faced before they ever sinned. And no, I don't mean before the sin of the spies, I mean before they've sinned, period. When describing feeding man to Bnei Israel, Moshe states that Hashem has vaya'ancha, vayarivecha, vayachilcha et aman, meaning before giving us what to eat in the desert, Hashem decided to cause us some distress and starve us, regardless of sin, which does seem to suggest that we got the premise wrong, and maybe we were meant to be in the desert for 40 years, regardless of sin? I'd like to point out that I'm not the first to suggest this ridiculous-sounding idea. Shaddad suggested way before me, and doing so differentiates between the purpose of punishment, which could be to get back at someone for their misdeeds, and what's happening here, which is a form of training or education, if you'd like. The purpose here is not to humiliate us as retribution for what we have done, but to ingrain in us characteristics that we're going to need in the future that might or might not have anything to do with the sin demanding atonement. And if I may add on my own, the fact that the same word, anotcha, is used both times could be to prove that there should be no difference between the final goal of punishment and education. They should both aim at building and molding and not getting back at someone. If you enjoyed this video and don't think I should be sent to another classroom for misbehaving, please subscribe and forward it to a friend. I am Dovi Holtz, one who loves Tanakh.